Okay, students, let's get underway. We're going to move into the area of learning more about the connection of the cultural context of the intercultural communication styles and what that involves. So let's get underway with learning some new terms and information. Some of the learning objectives that we will be working with will have to do with learning to recognize the different collectivity perspectives. There's a lot of information for us to glean from this, and we will get new perspectives of what researchers and the notions behind pan cultural types of communication and self awareness that we can be more aware of. Additionally, we're going to learn to identify some of the cultures that have this high context and some of the high and low context and the variables that exist within that. And then we're going to also look into comparing the different values having to do with cultures and certain expectations that I think you might be able to appreciate learning with regard to the values in communication. Additionally, we're going to talk about the small power clashes and power distant cultures that exist, and additionally learn and identify some of the weaknesses and things to avoid within the uncertainties of intercultural communication. Okay, let's move right into learning about individualism and collectivism. We will explore the differences between these two entities. Additionally, we'll learn and understand a little bit more about who is an individualist and collectivist and the traits that also they possess across the US and specifically globally. Additionally, we will look into communication consequences of the individualist and do a comparative with regards to that. Additionally, we will look at the vertical and horizontal aspect of that. And finally, we'll look into the pan-cultural self. Okay, let's talk about that. So let's jump right into learning more about this cycle of cultural context. We will look at this with regard to the human communication and really how it occurs and influence how we interact as humans. You know that culture provides this general framework of how we organize our thoughts and our emotions and those behaviors within our environment. So we're going to look into how culture teaches us how to think and interact, and look how the term communication and culture are interchangeable. And we're going to use this in respect to the human interaction and that paradoxical aspect. You know, we often think about culture with regard to the geography and that particular aspect, and this does really have an overall effect on us culturally as to where we fall into our values, habits, lifestyles having to do with that geographical location. With this, we're going to learn a little bit more about the anthropologists and how these communication researchers have looked into the various dimensions of how we differentiate between cultures. So we're going to really focus now on 5 different dimensions having to do with individualism, collectivism, high and low context, and the values that are the outcomes of this orientation process, and look at the power distance and how to look at how we sometimes have this avoidance that takes place. So we look within this dimension of cultural variability that has a lot to do with this continuum scale, such as the high side and the low degree. So we need to really focus upon how this takes place overall, specifically having to do with how we compare and contrast cultural and multicultural effects of how we are act as individuals and collective aspects. One example that I often look at is how, throughout Western world we are typically taught to speak up as individuals and have our own mindset development, whereas in other countries, such as, I'm spent a lot of time in China, where they are more of a collective thinking. They have that collectivism thinking process, and they look at that view as being extremely important on that spectrum. So we want to make sure that we understand that as individualists, we think for ourselves, and we want to make sure that we understand that culturally this is a way of processing as we look into the diversity of that spectrum of, the individual versus the collective thinker. So, the basic definition, I would say, with this individualism has to do with how we as individuals culturally kind of self-orientate ourselves with our uniqueness, and we have specific unique goals, individual goals, and we want to make sure that we look at those specifically, how they are emphasized over group goals. So that's the aspect that we want to look at with regard to the individual style of thinking. Whereas with the collectivism mindset, we look at this cultural orientation having to do with the groups that is, well, primarily based on that specific unit of thinking as a culture. So we look at the dynamics of the group goals that really will take priority over the individual goals. Okay, so that's how I want us to look at the different perspectives here on that. So let's take a moment to see if anyone has any questions regarding that. Okay, let's go ahead and see if we can spotlight a little bit more of what this actually looks like as these two entities, do they exist in the way we look at it, or are they exclusive or different? Well, individualism and collectivism are not mutually exclusive. Keep in mind that individuals can be characterized really more specifically as combinations of individualist and collectivism type of tendencies. We look at within family members and relationships versus business relationships. Those are some examples where we can find that individual relationships are motivated in and by particular situations. Okay, so moving on a little bit more, who's who? Let's get some overall information about who do we really perceive globally as having individualism framework or a mindset that way. So we look at some of the countries, such as, of course, the United States. Our text shares that Germany, India, Lebanon, New Zealand, Peru, Brazil, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, United Kingdom, and Argentina tend to be overall individualism thinkers. So that gives us some great perspective as to the difference of that mindset of individuals that think a certain way. And I think this is a really good illustration in order to give us some examples. Let's look at some of the behavioral traits that could be associated with these two entities. For example, those of the Western mindset, Western world globally, tend to think, as we mentioned, individually, and they have really high self esteem. They have areas that they're very optimistic, and they also tend to be satisfied with themselves and their goals. They appreciate having this freedom and free thinking. They have a real ease, really, with interacting with strangers and others because they're always hoping to glean new information and sharing thought processes. Additionally, they have low social anxieties, which is very interesting. They don't mind getting to know other individuals, and they know that they have a place, and they strive to find that as individuals. There is a preference to work alone often, seeking that independence and being free thinkers. We tend to do that. Whereas in the collectivism society, it's somewhat the opposite. They tend to need some type of affiliation with others. They're very sensitive to rejection, and they don't want to be embarrassed. We often hear of the term, within Asia, specifically China, and you hear of losing face. They shy away from putting themselves in situations where that might be a cause of embarrassment or to lose face. They are very proud of the group relationship. They like that as a preference. They identify to that group or collective way of thinking. They really are valuing the social network. So, I find it very interesting that me being in China during the time of the explosion of social media and apps, phone apps, and ways of communicating group, with we know like TikTok, of course, is a new upcoming very popular format, and in China we use WeChat and Facebook. These type of well, they don't use Facebook in China, but we here in Western states do, and but they really do like this, the value of that social networking process. So let's take a time to think about this and see if we have any questions having to do with this. So let's just take a break on that and see. All right, let's get right back into it here. We're going to move into vertical and horizontal individualism and collectivism. So we have researchers that have come up with a point of clarification with regard to this aspect of horizontal individualism is more of a cultural orientation in which it's really autonomous, having to do with self and how self is valued. Okay, so in contrast to looking at the vertical realization of individualism is that there is this cultural orientation in which an autonomous self is also extremely valued. And also, the self is really seen as kind of different from the, or unequal to others. So we need to look at examples such as vertical individualism, such as in Sweden or Austria, give real examples of this horizontal style of individualism. And within the horizontal arena, we see this as the cultural orientation, whereas the individual really views themselves as a true member of the in group, and they are very within this membership. The members are extremely familiar or similar to each other. So we look at this self independence, and we want to look at we're the same as others. So we look at this as very important. Again, giving an example of China as really being the best example of a horizontal collectivism as a framework. And I think that this is one way that we can really look at that to differentiate between the two, and that's a great example. So let's go in and see if we have any questions before we move on to pan-cultural self. Okay, so now that we're getting a clear understanding of this this new area of pan-cultural self, it has to do with maybe looking into self-enhancement, which really refers to this idea that people desire to maintain and, really keep up this strong, affirmative, positive self-view. And, the self-protection is this idea, which is the opposite, which we look at it as it means really to minimize the negative self-views. So, these are just some ways of looking at the difference between how we tend to self-enhance or self-protect who we are. And this does take place, culturally as well. So it gives us a better idea of how to look into these ways of the term pan-cultural. So let's take a minute to take some questions and get clarification on this. Okay, so this idea and pan-cultural self, the pan-cultural self is the self is really promoted, and individuals are encouraged to really pursue and develop their own individual qualities, abilities, and really having that mindset and attitude of self, and within cultures, people are taught to really be creative and to be competitive and having this really assertiveness. With regard to individual self is really the most fundamental basic definition of self-definition, whereas with the contrast of collective cultures, group goals that really become more important than the individual goals, and those values that we serve that in group are really stressed. And so we want to keep in mind that independence is quite important and is very stressed. In certain cultures, this collective self is really the primary and more fundamental true definition of this self-definition having to do with pan-cultural significance. Okay, now we are going to move into learning a little bit more about the high and low context communication. These have to do with certain characteristics. And just to give a brief definition of the high context, it means that the cultural orientation in which the meaning are or the meanings are gleaned from this aspect of the physical, social, and psychological context or point of reference. So that's what is indicated in the high context, whereas in the low context, it states that the cultural orientation in which the meanings are encoded in the verbal code. So let's just give some information with regard to this as far as some general examples. So the textbook gives us a great illustration that one of the researchers, Hall, suggests that if in the illustration of twins, stating that twins who have grown up together can and do communicate more economically, meaning the high contact, whereas two lawyers in a courtroom, such as during an important trial, may have that low context level. So this gives a little bit of information about how we are really, showing these characteristics between the two. And we know that within the high contact culture, we know and understand each other. And so there may be, real appropriate roles that are in place, and where words are not always the only thing that is needed to convey the meaning that we act according to the roles that are represented, more so than absolute of what is being said. So I think that's a really nice illustration of what this could be. Any questions on that? Okay, let's get a little bit more of a possible illustration of the area of the low context transaction. Within this, they have the verbal code that tends to be primarily more important than the counterpart of the high area, whereas it provides this source of information through that coding system. In this one, typically the low contact really relies upon more elaborate codes that are really needed in corresponding the message that needs to be created, and really having that ability to interpret that meaning more correctly. So there is information that needs to be shared with each other, having to do with how it's coded and in the verbal message that is taking place. And specifically, the individuals that use this low context communication are really more expected to communicate in ways that really might convey and be more consistent with their feelings, having to do with specifically this low level, typically involves transmitting direct, explicit messages, okay? And so we see that with regard to many low context cultures are, we know, individualists and having that mindset, including Switzerland, Germany, Scandinavia, US, France, and the United Kingdom. So this gives some overall information and a new viewpoint of learning the two in this particular area. Now, throughout our text, there are several self-assessments that you can look to if regarding you finding out a little bit more information about maybe where you stand within that particular high and low perspective. So let's take a moment and see if anyone has any questions having to do with this area. Okay, so now we're going to start learning a little bit about some of the different theories. And I wanted to start off by just stating again, culturally, that allowing our history and our cultural dynamics and values are so important, having to do with the elements of how we really communicate interculturally. So we want to touch a little bit now on certain theories that come to mind. Specifically, as our text does point out that Schultz has a theory of basic values, and really knowing that this theory really describes the natural the nature of the values and how we identify this. We identify ourselves through these characteristics, and we do this from a cultural standpoint. He specifically states that there are 10 basic values to consider, and it has a lot to do with the needs of individuals, as we are just kind of made up, even as biological, an organism that comes from us that way, and also just the various needs of social interaction, and a lot of our beliefs and these needs that do arrive typically might come through that and of a need of survival, and maybe the welfare of individuals and the values that really kind of outline this specific theory that is expressed here. Some of the basic values that are expressed has to do with self-direction. I'll go through the list. Just basically self-direction, stimulation, hedonism, achievement, power, security, conformity, tradition, benevolence, and universalism. So these are Schwartz's 10, the list of the 10 basic human values that are very important, that we all tend to contend to have a basis for the values and the functions, as we use that as a guide for who we are as individuals and how they make up our social behavior. So these are very important for us to recognize with regard to this cultural exchange and interaction. The next theory that we would like to talk about has to do with values orientation, which is Klockholm and Strodbeck's values orientation. And just to go over that particular bit of information, has to do with the self and family, and how these different values reflect, also having to do with individualism and the low context versus the collectivism and the high context. In our text, there's a great chart that kind of helps to define the different elements of the self, the family, and human nature, and the supernatural. So these are some of the aspects that that they use to point out the high and the low between that context, having to do with the individualist and the collectivist. So I won't go through each one of these step by step, but it definitely outlines all of the information having to do with self. We look at individualism, the age, sex, activity, for example. Within the family, we have to do, we're looking at the relational correlation and orientation, state of authority, perhaps, and the position or role of behavior and mobility. These are some of the areas within human nature. We're looking at the difference between good and evil, happiness, pleasure, mutuality, and also how that has the relationship between. Also, we look in nature, having to do with the relationship between humans and nature, and also ways of knowing nature and about nature, and the structure of nature, and this time concept having to do with nature. And then the last aspect here looks at the supernatural, having to do with the relationship between humans and the supernatural, kind of the meaning of life. Maybe religion comes into this, providence, and also knowledge of, the cosmic order of things. So this gives some good correlation as to the aspects of theory having to do with self and family. And yeah, let's take a moment just to think through this. Additionally, how it has to do with our society and human nature, physical nature, and again, supernatural. Let's take a moment to think about that just a second. Okay, so now we are going to move into the power distance and finding out about Hofstede and the aspects of this approach here, having to do with power distance. So what we look at that with regard to the definition is the extent to which the members of a culture expect and accept that power, and is perhaps unequally distributed. So let's just take a look at that, and to see, as he explains, that there's a small and large power distance that we need to recognize that really exists. And they point out this having to do with culturally, or having to do with geographic locations, having to do with different cultures, whereas those countries that might have a small power distance culture have to do with countries such as Denmark, Ireland, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Great Britain, Germany, Austria, Denmark. I think I may have said Denmark. And so this is the area where the culture typically has small power processes, whereas in the large power distance cultures tend to be countries such as Mexico, India, Brazil, Indonesia, the Philippines, and let's see, Panama, Guatemala, and Malaysia. It's interesting that I did get to travel to Malaysia as well, and it's interesting to be able to see now that the mindset when we look at the large power distance cultures that has a lot to do with the strict hierarchy among the family members, having to do where the father is the authoritarian within that particular area. And it kind of goes into sequence of followed by, the eldest then having that power according to that ladder, and then age and sex. Additionally, we find that the education within the educational system, of course, we look at the teachers having to do with that the respect that the older generations might really adhere to, and so that kind of gives some illustration as to these two levels having to do with the powers that exist within many cultures, and how they actually have this hierarchy within the family members. So areas that we need to consider is how these areas are measured of the power distance, the communication that exists within the power distance. For example, power distance affects the verbal and nonverbal behavior in a culture, having to do with the ways of we communicate with each other. So how do we really look at how they're measured is really a good starting point in how we can look at measuring the power distance, having to do with areas that where we're dependent in relationships or independent in relationships. So yeah, the text has a lot of information that you can also review, having to do with how the the procedure takes place throughout the globe. I think it's a very interesting perspective. So with that, let's just take a moment here to think it out and to see if we have any questions or comments here. Okay, this next section that we will be reviewing is referred to as uncertainty avoidance. So we can all kind of relate to this, I think, just regarding we know there's that communication apprehension that we've discussed as well. Now this new term having to do with in uncertainty avoidance, which basically is defined as the degree to which members of a particular culture feel threatened by unpredictability, uncertainty and or unknown situations. So that kind of goes hand in hand with where we have these other apprehensions as well in communication. This is a new term of uncertainty and avoidance. And there is that kind of like that graph of, we would rate it from the spectrum of being extremely uncertain and kind of freaking out on that area of uncertainty, whereas, going back to the higher level of certainty and maybe confidence. So the researchers here state that it occurs within communicating with someone from an unknown culture, which can be very uncomfortable in situations that we that we all face sometimes. We want to look into observing how to reduce this uncertainty. And however, we still remain very anxious in many instances until we get to know individuals. So we need to find different tools and to become aware of the degree of which, individuals and or cultures might feel really threatened by this, kind of like this a phobia even, where people might really be uncomfortable with uncertainties. So we need to make sure that we understand that there might be a certain belief that, that automatically comes from different cultures, and we need to remain curious in this. We need to look into how workers, for example, may be motivated by achievement and understanding, a better sense of belongingness. And so these areas of trying to find out how to make sure that we are really staying present with maybe even resisting that, certain resistances that come to play and keep us kind of locked or blocked into being innovative or creative, coming up with new ideas. And so, these are areas that we can look at. There is a theory that is related to this, having to do with the uncertainties generally tend to either go under the uncertain situations versus certain situations. Certain situations maybe become passive and disengaging, whereas under uncertain situation might, have engaging activity that might exist as well. So learning the differences between this active engagement and or passive disengagement, and which way do people tend to focus their uncertainties in these certain situations. So this theory really of uncertainty is based on Hofstede's idea of this particular concept. And, people in general develop, this self-regulating style in of uncertainty, and so it's a true fact that based on this theory that these elements do take place within intercultural conversations and individual concepts. So we just really need to make sure that we are aware of that they exist, and learn from that in order to be better communicators interculturally. So I think that is going to be it for now. And now we'll just continue with some discussion and make sure that all of our questions have been answered thoroughly.